Uma produção WGBH Boston associada a Harvard University. Qual a coisa certa a fazer? Justice, com Michael Sandel.
Today we turn back to Kant. Before we do, remember, this is the week by the end of which all of you will basically get Kant, figure out what he's up to. You're laughing. No, it will happen. Kant's groundwork is about two big questions. First, what is the supreme principle of morality? Second, how is freedom possible? Two big questions. Now, one way of making your way through this dense philosophical book is to bear in mind a set of oppositions or contrasts or dualisms that are related. Today I'd like to talk about them. Today we're going to answer the question, what, according to Kant, is the supreme principle of morality? And in answering that question, in working our way up to Kant's answer to that question, it will help to bear in mind three contrasts or dualisms that Kant sets out. The first, you'll remember, had to do with the motive according to which we act. And according to Kant, only one kind of motive is consistent with morality. The motive of duty, doing the right thing for the right reason. What other kind of motives are there? Kant sums them up in the category of inclination. Every time the motive for what we do is to satisfy a desire or a preference that we may have to pursue some interest, we're acting out of inclination. Now, let me pause to see if, in thinking about the question of the motive of duty, the goodwill, see if any of you has a question about that much of Kant's claim. Or is everybody happy with this distinction? What do you think? Go ahead.
When you make that distinction between duty and inclination, is there ever any moral action ever? I mean, you could always kind of probably find some selfish motive, can't you?
Maybe very often people do have self-interested motives when they act. Kant wouldn't dispute that. But what Kant is saying is that insofar as we act morally, that is, insofar as our actions have moral worth, what confers moral worth is precisely our capacity to rise above self-interest and prudence and inclination and to act out of duty. Some years ago, I read about a spelling bee, and there was a young man who was declared the winner of the spelling bee, a kid named Andrew, 13 years old. The winning word, the word that he was able to spell, was echolalia. Does anyone know what echolalia is? What? Some type of flower? It's not some type of flower, no. It means the tendency to repeat, as in echo, to repeat what you've heard. Anyhow, he misspelled it actually, but the judges misheard him. They thought he had spelled it correctly and awarded him the championship of the National Spelling Bee. And he went to the judges afterward and said, actually, I misspelled it. I don't deserve the prize. And he was regarded as a moral hero, and he was written up in the New York Times, Misspeller is a spelling bee hero. There's Andrew with his proud mother. But when he was interviewed afterwards, listen to this, when he was interviewed afterwards, he said, quote, "The judges said I had a lot of integrity." But then he added that part of his motive was, quote, "I didn't want to feel like a slime." All right, what would Kant say? Go ahead.
I guess it would depend on whether or not that was a marginal reason or the predominant reason in whether or not and why he decided to confess that he didn't actually spell the word correctly.
Good, and what's your name?
Vasco.
That's very interesting. Is there anyone else who has a view about this? Does this show that Kant's principle is too stringent, too demanding? What would Kant say about this? Yes.
I think that Kant actually says that it is the pure motivation that comes out of duty which gives the action moral worth. So it's like, for example, in this case, he might have more than one motive. He might have the motive of not feeling like a slime, and he might have the motive of doing the right thing for in and of itself, out of duty. And so while there's more than one motivation going on there, does not mean that the action is devoid of moral worth just because he has one other motive. So, because the motive which involves duty is what gives it the moral worth.
Good, and what's your name?
Judith.
Well, Judith, I think that your account actually is true to Kant. It's fine to have sentiments and feelings that support doing the right thing, provided they don't provide the reason for acting.
Yeah.
So I think Judith actually has mounted a pretty good defense of Kant on this question of the motive of duty. Thank you. Now, let's go back to the three contrasts. It's clear at least what Kant means when he says that for an action to have moral worth, it must be done for the sake of duty, not out of inclination. But as we began to see last time, there's a connection between Kant's stringent notion of morality and his specially demanding understanding of freedom. And that leads us to the second contrast, the link between morality and freedom. The second contrast describes two different ways that my will can be determined, autonomously and heteronomously. And according to Kant, I'm only free when my will is determined autonomously, which means what? According to a law that I give myself. We must be capable, if we're capable of freedom as autonomy, we must be capable of acting according not to a law that's given or imposed on us, but according to a law we give ourselves. But where could such a law come from? A law that we give ourselves? Reason. If reason determines my will, then the will becomes the power to choose independent of the dictates of nature or inclination or circumstance. So, connected with Kant's demanding notions of morality and freedom is a specially demanding notion of reason. Well, how can reason determine the will? There are two ways, and this leads to the third contrast. Kant says there are two different commands of reason. And a command of reason, Kant calls an imperative. An imperative is simply an ought. One kind of imperative, perhaps the most familiar kind, is a hypothetical imperative. hypothetical imperatives use instrumental reason. If you want X, then do Y. It's means ends reasoning. If you want a good business reputation, then don't shortchange your customers, word may get out. That's a hypothetical imperative. If the action would be good solely as a means to something else, Kant writes the imperative is hypothetical. If the action is represented as good in itself, and therefore as necessary for a will which of itself accords with reason, then the imperative is categorical. That's the difference between a categorical imperative and a hypothetical one. A categorical imperative commands categorically, which just means without reference to or dependence on any further purpose. And so you see the connection among these three parallel contrasts. To be free in the sense of autonomous requires that I act not out of a hypothetical imperative, but out of a categorical imperative. And so you see, by these three contrasts, Kant reasons his way, brings us up to his derivation of the categorical imperative. Well, this leaves us one big question. What is the categorical imperative? What is the supreme principle of morality? What does it command of us? Kant gives three versions, three formulations of the categorical imperative. I want to mention two and then see what you think of them. The first version, the first formula, he calls the formula of the universal law. Act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And by maxim, what does Kant mean? He means a rule that explains the reason for what you're doing, a principle. For example, promise keeping. Suppose I need money, I need $100 desperately, and I know I can't pay it back anytime soon. I come to you and make you a promise, a false promise, one I know I can't keep. Please give me $100 today, lend me the money, I will repay you next week. Is that consistent with the categorical imperative, that false promise? Kant says no. And the test, the way we can determine that the false promise is at odds with the categorical imperative is try to universalize it. Universalize the maxim upon which you're about to act. If everybody made false promises when they needed money, then nobody would believe those promises. There would be no such thing as a promise. And so there would be a contradiction. The maxim, universalized, would undermine itself. That's the test. That's how we can know that the false promise is wrong. Well, what about the formula of the universal law? You find it persuasive? What do you think? Go ahead.
I have a question about the difference between categoricalism and a hypothesis that if you're going to
between categorical and hypothetical
yeah.
imperatives.
Right. If you're going to act with a categorical imperative so that the maxim doesn't undermine itself, it sounds like I am going to do X because I want Y. I am going to not lie in dire need because I want the world to function in such a way that promises are kept.
I don't want to liquidate the practice of promises.
Right. It sounds like justifying a means by an end.
It seems like an instance of consequentialist reasoning, you're saying.
Right.
And what's your name?
Tim.
Tim. Well, Tim, John Stuart Mill agreed with you. He made this criticism of Kant. He said, if I universalize the maxim and find that the whole practice of promise-keeping would be destroyed if universalized, I must be appealing somehow to consequences.
Right.
If that's the reason not to tell a false promise. So John Stuart Mill agreed with that criticism against Kant. But John Stuart Mill was wrong. You're in good company, though. You're in good company, Tim. Kant is often read as Tim just read him, as appealing to consequences. The world would be worse off if everybody lied, because then no one could rely on anybody else's word. Therefore, you shouldn't lie. That's not what Kant is saying exactly, although it's easy to interpret him as saying that. I think what he's saying is that this is the test. This is the test of whether the maxim corresponds with the categorical imperative. It isn't exactly the reason. It's not the reason. The reason you should universalize to test your maxim is to see whether you are privileging your particular needs and desires over everybody else's. It's a way of pointing to this feature, this demand of the categorical imperative, that the reasons for your action shouldn't depend, for their justification, on your interests, your needs, your special circumstances being more important than somebody else's. That, I think, is the moral intuition lying behind the universalization test. So let me spell out Kant's second version of the categorical imperative, perhaps in a way that's more intuitively accessible than the formula of universal law. It's the formula of humanity as an end. Kant introduces the second version of the categorical imperative with the following line of argument. We can't base the categorical imperative on any particular interests, purposes, or ends, because then it would be only relative to the person whose ends they were. But suppose there were something whose existence has in itself an absolute value, an end in itself, then in it, and in it alone, would there be the ground of a possible categorical imperative. Well, what is there that we can think of as having its end in itself? Kant's answer is this: I say that man, and in general every rational being, exists as an end in himself, not merely as a means for arbitrary use by this or that will. And here Kant distinguishes between persons on the one hand and things on the other. Rational beings are persons. They don't just have a relative value for us, but if anything they have an absolute value, an intrinsic value. That is, rational beings have dignity. They're worthy of reverence and respect. This line of reasoning leads Kant to the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which is this: act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. So that's the formula of humanity as an end. The idea that human beings, as rational beings, are ends in themselves, not open to use, merely as a means. When I make a false promise to you, I'm using you as a means to my ends, to my desire for the $100. And so I'm failing to respect you. I'm failing to respect your dignity. I'm manipulating you. Now consider the example of the duty against suicide. Murder and suicide are at odds with the categorical imperative. Why? If I murder someone, I'm taking their life for some purpose, either because I'm a hired killer or I'm in the throes of some great anger or passion. Well, I have some interest, some purpose that's particular, for the sake of which I'm using them as a means. Murder violates the categorical imperative. For Kant, morally speaking, suicide is on a par with murder. It's on a par with murder because what we violate when we take a life, when we take someone's life, ours or somebody else's, we use that person, we use a rational being, we use humanity as a means. And so we fail to respect humanity as an end. And that capacity for reason, that humanity that commands respect, that is the ground of dignity, that humanity, that capacity for reason, resides undifferentiated in all of us. And so I violate that dignity in my own person if I commit suicide, and in murder if I take somebody else's life. From a moral point of view, they're the same. And the reason they're the same has to do with the universal character and ground of the moral law. The reason that we have to respect the dignity of other people has not to do with anything in particular about them. And so respect, Kantian respect, is unlike love in this way. It's unlike sympathy. It's unlike solidarity or fellow feeling or altruism. Because love and those other particular virtues or reasons for caring about other people have to do with who they are in particular. But respect for Kant, respect is respect for humanity, which is universal, for a rational capacity which is universal. And that's why violating it, in my own case, is as objectionable as violating it in the case of any other. Questions or objections? Go ahead.
I guess I'm somewhat worried about Kant's statement that you cannot use a person as a means because every person is an end in and of themselves. Because it seems that every day, in order to get something accomplished for that day, I must use myself as a means to some end. And I must use the people around me as a means to some end as well. For instance, suppose that I want to do well in a class, and I have to write a paper. I have to use myself as a means to write the paper. Suppose I want to buy something, food. I must go to the store and use the person working behind the counter as a means for me to purchase my food.
Right. That's true. You do. What's your name?
Patrick.
Patrick, you're not doing anything wrong. You're not violating the categorical imperative when you use other people as means. That's not objectionable, provided when we deal with other people for the sake of advancing our projects and purposes and interests, which we all do, provided we treat them in a way that is consistent with respect for their dignity. And what it means to respect them is given by the categorical imperative. Are you persuaded? Do you think that Kant has given a compelling account, a persuasive account of the supreme principle of morality? Reread the groundwork, and we'll try to answer that question next time.